Kayla, and then we will get to it. Let's see. I'm going to do this. We just did this and I'm not doing a great job. Okay. All right. Awesome. Okay, guys, let me introduce you to my friend, Kayla Schultz, who I have known since 6th grade. We've had many big adventures, and her big adventure that she is on now is mindfulness coaching and kind of learning to get out of your own way. And I thought, what better way to get out of our own way than to have a friend tell us about it. So I'm going to turn it over to Kayla, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end.
Awesome. Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, Jackie and I go way back, pre-social media, but somehow there are still hours of incriminating video footage of us pretending to be in sync. If you haven't asked her about that, you should yeah, definitely pop some questions about that one in. But I figured nobody has a VCR anymore to witness any of that. So probably safe showing my face around here, I think, I hope. But I'm just gonna try to figure out how to share my screen here. If you bear with me 1 second.
You'll just go down to the share screen button at the bottom, and that'll open you up to your PowerPoint.
Wonderful. Okay. And is there a big black box where the videos are? No, so I can actually, okay, cool.
Good, you should be able to present.
All right, do we see that clearly? Okay, awesome. So, like we've already said, my name is Kayla Schultz, and I am a professional coach and also an educator. I work in a cyber school where I actually teach children about mindfulness and social emotional learning. And Jackie, I'm assuming I should also let these people in that are trying to get in. Okay, so when Jackie asked me to come talk tonight, I was super excited because really talking about human potential is my passion. So I jumped at the opportunity. I'm excited to be here with you guys. I hope that I can share some things of value that can help you level up in your life, in your business, whatever you might be trying to accomplish. So I'm just going to dive right in. Maybe if I can move the slide. There we go. So I titled this presentation, The Stories We Tell, because whether or not we realize it, we spin stories about our lives. And then we take these stories and sometimes without realizing, we accept them for fact. And they just aren't always completely true. And oftentimes these stories are also not serving us. Some of them might be really helpful, but a majority of them really just are things that we have accepted and maybe forgot to challenge time and time again. So this presentation, I'm going to just check in with you about some stories that you might be spinning in your life. I'm going to share a lot about the stories that I have spun in my life, how I've become aware of them, kind of broken them down, and written new narratives that have really helped me to move forward in my life to achieve what I've been trying to achieve. So let me see here. Okay. I gotta move this thing out of the way. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. So there was a time in my life, roughly, 2009-ish, where I just was not happy. And I didn't know why. I knew that I felt bad, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was that was really getting me down. And the one day I was just sitting there and kind of had this aha moment that like every action that I was taking and every thought that I was having was because I either really, really wanted to feel a certain way, which was usually something positive and good, or avoid feeling something, which was usually negative or difficult to sit with. And the more that I have worked through my journey and really taken on a mindfulness practice and done all of my coaching education, most things in life boil down to this one sentence. So whatever goals you might have in your business, you might be thinking, if I can get to this point, then I'll feel really good about myself. So it's rooted in that desire to feel that confidence in yourself. Or if I could just get this financial freedom, then I could really give back in ways that I haven't been able to before and make me feel like I'm contributing, like make you feel like part of something bigger than yourself. And so every action and thought and belief that we have is rooted in this either desire to feel something or avoid feeling something. But unfortunately, we spend more time often than not trying to avoid things. And that's where our energy is going. So to understand this stuff fully, we need to look at some science. And the reason I think science is important, even though I'm awful at it and don't understand basic things about science like weather patterns, which I get made fun of in my house all the time for, science stuff is really important because it gives us a basis to understand how our bodies are responding to the things that are happening to us. So I'm going to try to quickly go through the science so that we can get into the mindfulness and the stories. So there's a very wise neuroscientist named Dr. Taylor, and she has done a bunch of research on emotional responses in the body. And basically, an emotion to your body is a 90-second chemical process. And beyond that point, anything that you continue to feel is you choosing to stay in that emotional loop. And when I first heard that, I'm like, A, that sounds like heaven to experience an emotion for a whopping, 90 seconds. And B, I call bull, because I don't think I've ever just sat down and experienced an emotion for 1 minute and 30 seconds. They usually drag on in some capacity. And it's really hard to wrap my head around that I would choose to stay in a negative emotional loop. Like I couldn't wrap my head around that. But the more I looked into it, I realized, in a perfect world, I could sit there and just observe what's happening, maybe label it, acknowledge it, feel it, and let it go. And that would take 1 minute and 30 seconds. But I wasn't doing that. And it all boiled down to what I was thinking. And I was choosing thought that were re-stimulating that circuitry. So I was having that chemical reaction for that negative emotion, that loop that I was in over and over and over again. So when this happens, one day it might be a mood, a couple months, you might be in kind of like a state of being, but then, long term of reactivating some of the circuitry, it can really become a personality and feel like your reality. So this is the big slide here, and this is the most science that we're going to go into at this moment. But what happens is when you get stuck in those loops. So I just chose this story here. She doesn't like me. I chose this because I was going through something a few years ago of trying to meet mom friends. And I don't know if anybody's ever tried to go through that, but it's a super intimidating process. I just moved to a new area and I'm like, oh my gosh, mom friends, why does this feel so huge to me? But, I had an interaction at my kids' preschool that I felt was cold and kind of unwelcoming. And my mind immediately went to they don't like me. She doesn't like me. This is not going to be the place that I find my friends. And I found myself driving my kids to drop off, white knuckling it, lost in this thought pattern of, oh my gosh, I'm getting rejected. This is not going to go well for me. And so while I'm thinking this thought and fearing this emotion, I'm how am I going to prevent this from happening? And well, my knee-jerk reaction was to isolate. So then I'd go into preschool, eyes to the ground, just focusing solely on my child and not really making myself open or available to anyone. And what I got were affirming outcomes. Nobody was approaching me because I was basically becoming unapproachable with my isolation response. And I was really just looking at my surroundings and affirming what I was believing to begin with before I even got there, before I was in the scenario of like, these people don't like me. So I saw all of the things that just reaffirmed that when I was in that situation. And so I was stuck in that negative emotional loop, and my body was getting flooded with all of these chemicals that correspond to negative emotions, like sadness and rejection and isolation and loneliness. And so I did that time and time again because I drove my kids every single day to preschool. And here's where the real kicker is. So our bodies and our brains want us to be good at the things that we seem to want. So if what I'm telling my body is, I want to feel like this, I want to feel like this, I want to feel like this, your cells actually shift the receptors that they have on them for the chemical concoction of these reactions that keep getting dumped into your system. So A, your body physically changes its cells. And then B, your brain sees you constantly activating this pathway, like, oh, rejection, isolate, and then feel sad about not being with people and looking for affirming things for that story in our environment. And then, so our brain takes it one step further. And I don't know if you've ever heard the saying of what fires together wires together, but you essentially get really, really efficient at this neural pathway lighting up. And so much so that there's something on your neurons called a myelin sheath. And what scientists have discovered is that the increased thickness of that, which happens from repeatedly activating a pathway, actually increases the efficiency. So then the electrical impulse travels faster and faster and faster. So you don't even feel like there's an opportunity to choose a different response. So it's like, this is fact. This is my reality. I've seen this self-fulfilling prophecy time and time again. And so your story feels like the only possible way that things can play out. But the truth is, you can dismantle that story and write a new one and take that to the all other reactions and all those other potential new outcomes, rather than this one pathway that you've been activating and getting really good at, and making your body efficient at operating with. So when I talk to people about this in coaching, I often get a response like, this isn't a story, this is my reality. And, that's when I realized that there's some awareness that we need to bring to the picture. So what we're going to talk about next is just the coaching side of things, and how I'm going to give you some tools and tips right now that you can put into use today to start working on some of the stories that you might have that might be holding you back in life. So when we spoke about this before, we kind of talked about some of the things that you guys might be coming up against in your business. Just like not enough time to do the things you want to do, maybe fear of failure, some self-doubt about being able to build this business, maybe some hesitations about the views of direct sales and approaching people about what you're doing. And, all of these stories have very similar ones in so many things that I take on in my life. I like to put them in my very own book of bull, because it really is just things that I tell myself to try to avoid feeling something difficult. So the first step is awareness. And so there's kind of 3 stages of awareness. And the first stage is through reflection. You get to the point where you sit down after an interaction and say, maybe my perception was off or limited by what I believe is possible or the way things should be. And at that moment, you recognize that maybe there's a possible pattern there. If you keep practicing reflection, eventually you'll move into that second stage where you will have the awareness in the moment. You still have the thought, you still have the knee-jerk reaction, but maybe mid yelling at your spouse, you realize, oh my gosh, this is not where I wanted to take this. This is not the reaction that will benefit me or anybody else involved. And so you see the pattern in action, you're closer to recognizing it in proximity to the actual trigger of it. And so you'll have that awareness in the moment. And when you keep practicing that, that's when you get to like the bread and butter stage here, is you have awareness before. And so this awareness before inserts a pause, and that pause is what allows you to breathe and choose a more beneficial response. So at this point, you decide, I'm creating a new pattern, I'm writing a new narrative. So awareness isn't something that, well, this whole process that I'm going to go through is not something that you flip a switch and it just magically changes. This is a very step-by-step process that takes focus and intentional concentration on it almost on a daily basis. But there are some things that you can do to help yourself along. So when you realize you've gotten this awareness, I have a story that's absolute crap, and it feels real, it feels awful, and it's holding me back from reaching my goals. You can dismantle this with something I call brain dump. And what I do, I have a journal. I don't know if anybody else does, but I'm kind of have this like odd obsession with office supplies. So I have about 50 different journals and I pick one of them up and I brain dump. And I write that whole stinking narrative down, indulging myself as much as I want. I can be as petty or as ridiculous as I need to be to feel like I have really embodied what it is that I keep turning to justify myself or my emotions, or try to avoid those from popping up and taking over. And then I go back through that juicy story that I just dished out there, and I cross out any of the parts that aren't 100% fact. This can be challenging, especially at first, but I usually give the parameters. If it can't be proven by science, or it doesn't happen every single time, if it's not an always or never, cross it off. And then look at what you're left with and rewrite a new narrative with just the remaining facts. Now, sometimes I get to the end of this process and I have literally crossed out everything. Everything that I said is like not anywhere near fact. It's just things that I have been telling myself for whatever reason, some sort of protective mechanism in my brain. And at that point, then I just write down, I have been experiencing unhelpful emotions about this subject, whatever it might be. I have a desire to feel better about this subject. Something like that simple and that general can be a great starting point for a new narrative. And then you can really work through, I'm sorry, it looks like the world is coming to an end outside my window right now. So I just had to glance at the lightning because it scared me. So whenever you have this new narrative, you have your new starting point, but there's still one more step that you can take here that will really have you digging deeper through that inner world that we sometimes try to shy away from. So the first step is take a look at that first juicy story that you wrote, all of the indulgences and all of the pettiness, whatever you wrote down there, and ask yourself the question, what am I worried about? For me, I did this exercise on myself the one time, and I realized I was worried about speaking up. I didn't like speaking up. And then I had to figure out, what am I assuming will happen if I speak up? So for me, one of my highest values is like peace and harmony. I like cooperation. I love collaboration, and just having that environment where everybody's seen and heard. There's a deep democracy. Like, that's a huge thing for me in my life, and I value that highly. And sometimes I feel like if I'm going to speak up and share my point of view, I'll be seen as pushy or rocking the boat. So in holding on to this old narrative, I was really committing to not being seen as pushy. And I had to ask myself, like, is that always true? And really go out in the world and test those assumptions, which can sometimes be uncomfortable. But this is where the work happens. And this is where you discover, like, oh, wow, I've been telling myself a whole bunch of lies that have been keeping me in this very small comfort zone. When in actuality, if I could just tweak what I'm telling myself, even the slightest bit, it opens up worlds. And so, like, just as an example, I used to work in a school district where we collaborated in the small teams, and I had a fantastic small group that I worked with, and everybody respected each other, and I really admired the people in this group. And we were talking about, you know, a hot button topic that was very emotionally charged, and everybody was being respectful, but I had a point of view that I thought might be an unpopular opinion. And I sat there biting my tongue and biting my tongue and biting my tongue, because I did not want to rock the boat. I did not want to be seen as pushy or, you know, trying to like be devil's advocate or something like that. So I eventually got to the point where I did speak up, and immediately my reaction was read the nonverbal. And I looked at the woman that I admired so highly, and the look on her face convinced me that I had just totally lost her respect, totally lost her appreciation for what I brought to the group. And then for the next 3 days, I poured all of my energy into avoiding this woman and not going to the break room to heat up my lunch because I didn't want to accidentally bump into her, and like just bending over backwards to avoid what I was 100% sure was going to be a confrontation. And 3 days later, she came into my classroom and she said, "Hey, I just wanted to thank you for speaking up and sharing what you did, because it really challenged my thinking about the situation. And I thought your insights were really valuable." And I was like, so all that worry and all that effort and energy poured into avoidance. And I totally misread the nonverbal because I was looking for the confirmation of what I believed rather than what actually was. And so I want you to think about where you might be doing that in your life, because these big assumptions really keep us operating in such a small sphere. And there's just so much more to what could be your reality if you'd open yourself up to possible alternative results. So that's just something, the brain dump, and then the big assumptions that you could start doing tonight with a journal and just some honest reflection. So everything that I just touched upon is just the tip of the iceberg. And what's really sad to me is that nobody teaches us about this stuff in school. And that's why I'm such a proponent that coaching is for everyone, just as much as I believe therapy is for everyone. And I really am a huge proponent for infusing this in our schools, which is also my other mission that I am currently on. So, but if you aren't familiar with coaching, I just wanted to touch on what coaching is. And it's about transformation. And, you know, if you say transformation to my 5-year-old, she's like, "Cool, am I getting wings?" And I'm like, "Nah, not quite." So like, I always like to clarify, because there are some words that people people end up putting their own spin on just because of what society makes them out to be. But transformation, I define as just a really profound change. And it comes from bringing awareness to who we are and where we're at, and just really challenging ourselves to look at things differently, new perspectives, fresh orientation, new direction. It's easy to get stuck in ruts in life. And like I said, start accepting those ruts for the only way that things can be. And coaching isn't about picking apart what's broken with a person and like trying to piece it all back together and you know, fix things. There's no part of that in coaching. Coaching just honors what is, where you're at, and challenges you to reach for what's emerging, what needs to come through you, because as human, it's human nature to want to grow and evolve and expand. And we all have these desires and these big dreams, and coaching just helps you get into alignment with who you really are, greater alignment with yourself. So that's really the heart of coaching. And I always like to clarify how that differs from some of the other things that we kind of get lumped in with, because therapy is more about focusing on the past and healing. And, you know, therapy is usually a requirement when something's getting in the way of daily tasks. There have been many times where I actually make referrals to therapists. Like, you know what, I think this is something that would be better addressed with a therapist, because we keep maybe bumping up against the same wound that we're not getting past. But coaches, our focus is forward, and to really take a look and engage with your present moment to create a more desirable future. So, you know, coaches work with clients who are ready to grow in that moment. And there isn't anything we need to dig through in the past to kind of heal before you're ready to grow. Consulting is more just with the organization, whereas coaching, there is small group coaching and large group coaching, but I focus just with individuals and discovering and creating your own solutions. And mentoring, like coaching really isn't about imparting any kind of knowledge or coming up with answers. It's about discovering who you are and challenging you to access those inner resources and recognize existing external resources and put it all together to just really go full speed ahead towards what it is that you want to get out of your life. So my title is a mindfulness coach, and that also sometimes throws people. So I really like to just clarify what mindfulness coaching is. So I said before, you know, at the beginning of my presentation, you know, 2009 is when this all kind of started. I was kind of at my low point. I was working on Wall Street. I hated every second of my job, and the stress was just through the roof. And I discovered mindfulness as a way to help deal with my stress. And it's actually, I credit it single-handedly as the most profound change I've ever made in my life. And I became frustrated when I saw how much of a positive impact it had on my life. It isn't something that's shared and taught, because every human has the ability to apply these things. The tools are already inside of you. And so that's how I stumbled upon coaching. And it's, you know, coaching has so much mindfulness already intertwined in it. And, you know, I just use my training from mindfulness to inform my approach to coaching. So that's really the only difference. You know, some people are health coaches, some people are, I don't know, trying to think of other executive coaching. Like I just have my practices rooted in mindfulness. So that was a whole lot of information that I just shared in a very short amount of time there. So I just wanted to open it up for any questions that anybody might have, and give you my contact information if you thought that coaching might be something that would be a good fit to help you move forward in any aspect of your life. I'd be happy to do a discovery call with you just to see how we might be able to work together. And I've talked to Jackie too about arranging a discount for your team for anybody that's interested. So please feel free to reach out. You can check out my website too. It's still being built in some capacities, but most of the important information is on there. And yeah, so any questions? Fire away.
I grabbed a question from a teammate that couldn't be here, and I threw it in the chat, but you probably can't see the chat, so I will read it to you.
Okay.
How do we handle balancing our own happiness while taking on others' struggles? Example, I'm a relatively happy and centered person. Most times I'm able to compartmentalize my own personal life and others. But once in a while, the lines blur. What's an effective strategy to keep that solid?
So what popped into my head right away was a question of what's driving you to want to take on other people's struggles. I think that discovering the root of that might shed some light on what the motivation is, and why. Because really in life, we can only be responsible for our own happiness, and we cannot, it's everybody's personal responsibility for their own happiness. So we can't really, impact or create somebody else's happiness. Like we might think, oh, if I just do this and, put on this dog and pony show, like that's going to help that person. And in reality, that's what we think they need, might not be what they actually need. So I think the root of that would be figure out what your motivation is that you feel you need to take on other people's struggles. And then it would be working through that narrative of, what's your big assumption? What's going to happen if you don't take on other people's struggles? And what would that look like for you? So that strategy that I, gave in the PowerPoint would actually be really applicable there, to just dig through that narrative of what's the pressure to take on other people's struggles. And, there are ways to support it, to support people without being a burden, and maybe kind of not taking on their burden is the words that I was looking for there. So just maybe exploring some of those other supports that would be available too. So it could be a twofold approach.
I think that and I think you're right. And I think she means, as a leader, sometimes you take on other people's problems as your own so that, to lessen their burden or whatever. And I think you're right that you can't take on other people's stuff. You have to separate it.
Mm-hmm. Bless you.
Thank you. But you have to separate it in a healthier way, and you can support without being a dumpster for other people's stuff.
Yeah, because honestly, becoming a dumpster makes you less effective overall in that leadership role. So, self-care plays a big role in being an effective leader. And a big part of self-care is that boundary setting and finding out, okay, so if I set these boundaries and there's a negative reaction, navigating that, because it's there's so many different types of personalities that you will come up against in that type of setting. And it's a difficult, it takes practice. It takes intentional focus. It takes, you have to be in a space where you can hold space for other people without. Sometimes it looks like helping. Did you lose me? Okay. Sometimes it looks like, maybe sharing resources that have helped you that might help them. Like there's just so much to dig through there, but yes, healthy ways to support them without letting them dump it on you.
I have other questions from other people, but I want to make sure that anybody who's here gets a question answered if they have one.
I'm going to stop sharing. Can I do that? So I can see. I like seeing faces. Okay.
Yeah, if anybody who's here has a question, pop on in. And if not, I will keep talking because I have a couple other ones from people who couldn't be here.
I have a question that I can ask. So I've done a lot of self-awareness, and I was actually a psychology major, but I'm curious because I tend to look for mantras to help me through some of that. So I was wondering if you've ever used mantras and if you have a favorite that you wouldn't mind sharing with the group.
Yeah, actually, I'm a big believer in mantras for especially like creating new neural pathways. You know, when you get stuck in those thoughts that aren't helping you, just coming up with something that's like, it's almost rote memorization, but it's got to feel good for you too. So I usually go to everything's always working out for me and for the greater good. And that's kind of how I approach everything. Like this morning, life blew up in my face. My husband woke up with like a tick-borne illness and he's like, I don't know if I could take the kids tonight. And like, so it's just like scramble. And then I had to pause and I have to say, everything is always working out for me and for the greater good. And sure enough, the day settled, everything worked out. You know, you have, I always too, I'm a big proponent of catch it early, because, you know, you have those triggers that send you into that emotional loop. But if you can catch it early, you don't build the momentum. And I think that's also a big key to a lot of this is that awareness of like, okay, there's the trigger. I'm starting to feel this. Everything is always working out for me. Everything is always working out for me. You know, just the simple shifts and, you know, breath work too. There's, you know, just 3 to 5 deep breaths can shift your body out of that fight or flight and back into the rest and digest. Something as simple as just like sitting down and taking, like, make your inhale 3 seconds, your exhale 5 seconds. Do that 3 to 5 times more if you can, and you will actually feel your body like calm itself and shift out of that. So yeah, great question. Thanks.
James and Jason, you popped on for a second. I didn't know if you had something you wanted to ask.
We did, and then we realized that the lighting's really bad, so we turned the camera off because we're multitasking. We're making samples together while we listen. One question or a thought that I had is when you talked, there was a section where you're talking about reflection, like stopping yourself mid-moment, and then the third one was like to not plan, but like to prepare. Could you talk a little bit more about that going from maybe that step 2 to 3, because that step 3, like it's almost, I'm not saying that you have to like have that premonition that it's going to go there, but how do you start recognizing those patterns so that you could prep yourself before that situation?
That's a great question. So there isn't a blanket approach that works because every human is so unique. But the one thing that I would suggest, and this can start with step 1, that reflective, is write it down, because when you write something down, you really solidify that in your learning. So if you are writing it down, you're making that awareness at the forefront of your attention. And then when you catch yourself in 2 and you're in the middle, that's when you'll start asking the question, what would be a more effective response for me at that point? And when you have time, sit down and write out. You can go as far as what would be the ideal response that I could have in this situation. If it's something common that comes up for you and you see that you've tried on different responses and none of them are really working great, you can write down what would be the ideal response. And I've noticed in doing this that it has less to do with my external response and more to do with how I feel internally that I'm shooting for. Like, okay, so this really shook me up, but in reality, I'd love to be able to stay calm through this, because when I'm calm, I'm able to come up with the best verbal external response that fits the specific scenario that I'm in. So I think, you know, like I said, like, there's so many variables that come in when you as a human are working with other humans to like really say, you know, you can prep for this and you could write every single possible response down and it still might not fit for what comes up that triggers you. So really when I journal and try to transition from 2 to 3, I try to focus on what's the internal world need to look like for me when I feel this trigger, and what's the ideal response internally that I could have that would help me stay present in that moment to really address what's going on authentically and compassionately, and whatever it might be that you're looking to do, that you're not going to spiral into your own emotional loop and lose your focus on what you're trying to solve there. Does that help?
Yes, very much.
Okay.
I just the idea of the writing it down, I think that's probably a big crucial step right there, because like you said, like your brain thinks in a different way when you're writing. You're more into you're turned into what you're actually thinking, and that just I can see how that process itself could help stop that like negative cycle that happens in your brain sometimes.
Yeah. There's a reason they told us to take notes in school. Like, it really does help solidify it in our brain and like process it and put it in there to pull it back out later. So yeah, great question. Thanks.
I have the most intuitive, awesome team ever.
You really do. What a fantastic group of humans. I love it.
It's true. One question that came up a lot when I was talking to some people who feel like they're actively doing things to sabotage themselves, was, how do I stop making the decision for other people? Specifically, in our business, we have to put ourselves out there a lot. So they tell themselves some stories where they are victimized before anything happens. Okay. So how do they stop that narrative and stop spinning that narrative where they are where they're the victim before anything even happens to them?
So in addition to what we talked about, like hashing through the narrative, pulling out the facts, and finding the big assumptions, another thing that I sometimes do before I ever start testing things is I keep track, like in some way, sometimes on my phone, sometimes in like a notebook or whatever, of times that I was actually the victim, actually like full on outright victimized. I do this with rejection a lot. So like, how many times have I actually been rejected to my face? Can't even count. Like it's less than what's on one hand, But the thing is we need to realize that those moments, the attention that we give to them, the heightened response that we feel because of them, our brain makes note of those things and adds it to the safety checklist. Like, oh goodness, could this situation victimize me, reject me, blah, 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 and then you set into those stories and avoidance patterns. So I think, having the data, that's just how my brain works, of having the data of being like, oh, probability actually tells me that that's not the likely outcome of this. So sometimes just that data in front of my face is enough for me to say, there are other possibilities. And then I'm in a better place from there. I feel like other things are possible. And just that little glimmer of hope can build momentum in the opposite direction for you to be in a better place to do.
Did we lose you? I think we might have, or maybe it's me.
For everybody else, or just me. Oh, there you are.
I wasn't sure if it was me or if it was you.
I don't know. Everybody else was moving, but you were like this.
It's just my face, okay?
Beautiful as always, yes.
Does anybody else have anything they want to pop on and ask? I almost called you KG because that's how I know you.
That's all right, Jackson.
If anybody has any questions, you can also pop them, if you're watching this on the recording, you can pop them into the comments in the group, and I have like a pretty direct line to this girl, so I can get some answers, or if you want to get in contact with her via her email or website, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Wonderful. No other questions?
I don't think so. I think we're free.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I really
Thank you
enjoyed
so
it.
much.
I loved it. I love it. This stuff lights me up inside. So I'm excited to talk about it with people who are into it. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you in the chat.
Yeah, thank you a lot. That was a lot of great information.
Great. I'm happy to hear that. Thank you for having me, guys. It was great.
Of course, it is my great pleasure. Thank you so much, friend. And I am going to stop